Good day. Greetings. Yes? Greetings. what you need. under control. Amazingly, a farmhouse that was also on the property was untouched by the fire. When police went inside to look around, they made a gruesome discovery. The owner of the house, a 73-year-old man, was dead in his bed with a bag over his head and a bullet wound to the skull. What police found next shocked them even more. They discovered a hidden entrance to a secret room, also untouched by the flames. Inside the room, they found bodies dressed in ceremonial robes arranged in a circle on the floor. As they continued to search, they found more bodies in other rooms, and that was just the beginning. I'm Kathy Kinzora, and for the next few episodes of History of the 90s, we're looking back at doomsday cults and their rise to infamy in the years leading up to the new millennium. In part one, we uncover a religious sect with branches in Canada, Switzerland, and France. Its members included politicians, journalists, executives, and police officers. We'll look at how members hoping to start a new life instead found horrific and tragic ends. This is the little-known story of the Order of the Solar Temple. The 90s were a tumultuous time. The world was feeling more and more dangerous, and it often seemed like we were headed toward war, environmental destruction, and social breakdown. As a way to cope with an uncertain future, some people turned to new religions. Groups like the Order of the Solar Temple. The Solar Temple was founded in Geneva, Switzerland in 1984 by Luc Jouret and Joseph de Membro. Like many new religions or cults, it appealed to people who were seeking spiritual fulfillment outside of traditional religions. It was extremely secretive, so very little is known about the group's actual beliefs and how they operated. But here's what we do know. Its leaders predicted a global man-made catastrophe before the year 2000. They told followers that only those who subscribed to their strange blend of Catholicism, the occult, and astrology would escape the impending doom by transitioning from Earth to a new life on the star Sirius. The Solar Temple leaders also considered themselves heirs to the Knights Templar, the military religious order that was entrusted with guarding Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land during the Crusades. The Knights Templar grew to great wealth and power in the 12th century and were defenders of the Holy Grail. But in 1312, they were accused of heresy by King Philip IV of France, and the order was destroyed. Quite a few organizations that revived the medieval knights' rituals, symbols, and traditions continued to pop up during the 19th and 20th centuries, including the Order of the Solar Temple. Luc Jouret, the Solar Temple's charismatic frontman, was born in Africa in 1947, in the Belgian Congo, or as we know it today, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He returned to Belgium with his family in the 1950s, and in 1974, he received a medical degree from the Free University of Brussels. But almost immediately, he became disillusioned with modern medicine. According to a pamphlet distributed by the Solar Temple in the 1980s, Jouret spent 10 years searching around the world for the origins of illness and the best way of healing. He studied everything from acupuncture in China to high mountain medicine in the Andes and bush medicine in Africa. His long journey led him to homeopathic medicine, which he studied in Mexico and Argentina. But Jouret had two almost paradoxical sides. In addition to his interest in becoming a homeopathic healer, he was also fascinated with religion and the occult. In the early 80s, he set up a homeopathic practice in France, near the border of Switzerland. And he also started traveling and lecturing around Europe and Quebec. His talks usually began by discussing homeopathic medicine, but then he quickly moved on to more religious and apocalyptic themes. This is him in a video that's still up on YouTube. Jouret is being interviewed for a homeopathic conference in 1983.
Comme tout mot humain, c'est un qualificatif, c'est un mot. Vous savez, le mot exprime peu de choses. Encore que le verbe est créateur, je suis bien d'accord, mais le mot reflète en fait peu de choses et tout à la fois. Alors, se définir homéopathe, c'est...
He was soft-spoken, dressed nicely in a suit and tie, and was handsome in an unassuming way. Rosemarie Opplinger, one of his early followers, told Maclean's magazine in 1995 that Jouret was like John F. Kennedy. She said he was a charismatic leader, a nice-looking man, but one thing for sure is he always went after rich people. Among the groups he lectured was the Golden Way Foundation, a New Age group in Geneva, Switzerland, and he became close friends with the foundation's leader, Joseph DeMambro. No one predicted, though, that this friendship would lead to something much more sinister. Joseph DeMambro, the financial mastermind of the Solar Temple, was born in France in 1924. And before that fateful meeting with Jouret, he had founded several New Age organizations of his own, including the Golden Way. It too was based on the mythology and the beliefs of Templar Knights. DeMambro had some success with the organization, but he knew if he wanted to expand, he needed an inspirational leader to attract more followers. An inspirational leader like Jouret. In 1984, DeMambro teamed up with Jouret, and together they formed the Order of the Solar Temple. Now, what's important to remember is that this group was highly secretive. So many of the details are very vague, but what we know is that Jouret was the group's high priest and his charismatic frontman. He used his skills to recruit new members, while DeMambro fashioned himself as the group's connection to divine masters. He claimed he could receive and transmit messages and visions with them. At its peak in 1989, the Solar Temple had nearly 500 members. Unlike other cults, like, say, the Manson family that preyed on the most vulnerable members of society, many of those who joined Jouret and DeMambro were rich and highly educated.
The fact that people are intelligent and well-situated financially does not make them any less in need, either emotionally, spiritually, psychologically.
That's Michael Kropfeld. He's the executive director of InfoCult, an organization in Quebec that he co-founded in 1980 to educate people about cults and other potentially dangerous movements and organizations. Kropfeld and his co-founders were inspired to form the organization after they were forced to kidnap and deprogram a friend who'd been brainwashed by the Unification Church, better known as the Moonies. Kropfeld says the Order of the Solar Temple was quite selective with who they allowed into their organization.
A certain way I look at it is if you're going to start any kind of organization, who are you going to want to get involved? And in many cases, you're going to want the best educated, those who have the best resources. Is kind of like a business operation. You want the best. So especially if you're able to pick and choose, which was seem to be the case with Solar Temple, you're going after those that are going to basically give the best kind of profile to the organization. At the same time, they're going to be very committed because they're interested in what the group has to sell.
At first, the Solar Temple operated in Switzerland and France. But around 1986, Jouret and DeMambro moved with some of their followers to an area of Quebec called the Laurentians. They bought a modern chalet complex on an acre of land in the little ski town of Morin Heights. The complex, which was valued at $500,000, was nestled in the birch trees of the Laurentian Mountains, about 60 kilometers north of Montreal. There were 3 units in the complex, and they were joined by passageways. Jouret owned 1 unit, DeMambro owned 2. Neighbors say the property was always kept in good shape, the lawn was cut and the snow was plowed, but rarely did they see any people who lived there. Michael Kropfeld says Quebec was picked as the basis of operations, not just because the province is French-speaking.
Quebec is considered, at certain times, it's a very fertile terrain for the emergence of different spiritual religious groups. Since the, let's say, demise, I wouldn't say demise, but rather the change, dramatic change in terms of the role that the Catholic Church once had in Quebec. And that kind of vacuum that created once the kind of power and role that the church had in Quebec changed.
The Solar Temple also established an organic farm in Quebec at a former monastery in a sleepy little village called Sainte-Anne-de-la-Parade on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. They bought the 100-year-old monastery and 100 acres of land for $235,000. They grew organic tomatoes, carrots, and other vegetables, which fit in with Jouret's initial focus on living a holistic lifestyle. The Solar Temple also bought a farmhouse in the ritzy ski village of Saint-Sauveur, just minutes away from Morin Heights. This is where Jouret hosted motivational retreats on the weekend. People paid between $300 and $500 to hear Jouret lecture about the benefits of homeopathic medicine. He also held expensive seminars for business people on personal development. From what we can tell, these lectures and seminars were a lucrative business, but they were kept separate from the group's spiritual beliefs. Over time, though, Jouret seemed to become more and more obsessed with an upcoming apocalypse. And in 1988, he announced to his followers that the world would soon be engulfed in warfare and famine. He said only Quebec would be spared. As part of their religious ceremonies, members of the Solar Temple would join Jouret late at night, dressed in hooded robes of red, black, gold, or beige, as Jouret delivered long sermons about the decadence of modern civilization and man's alienation from nature. A video made by the Solar Temple, which came to light years later, shows men and women with blurred-out faces in long white capes with red crosses over their hearts. They're walking solemnly throughout a candlelit room, carrying ornate swords and drinking champagne. Jouret told members that only 100 people would be selected to survive the impending doom, and he would be the one to decide who lived and who died. According to the book Doomsday Cults by Alan Warren, Jouret started to exert strict control over cult members by doing things like telling them who they could marry, and in some cases, dissolving existing marriages altogether. And eventually, Jouret changed his prophecy. He no longer believed Quebec would be spared from the apocalypse. Instead, he claimed the only way members could survive was by transitioning to a new life on the star Sirius. And this would be done by committing suicide. The change in the group's direction eventually caused friction among members. Some were angry, and they were very concerned and began to question Jouret's leadership, while others, they decided to quit altogether. Things were not going as planned for Jouret and de Membro. But it was just the beginning. Things would get much worse in 1993, when the Solar Temple became the subject of a major police investigation in Quebec. Jouret and two of his followers were charged with trying to purchase revolvers that were equipped with silencers, which are illegal in Canada. After the arrest, police also began investigating Jouret and the Solar Temple in connection with another incident that happened the year before. In November '92, a paramilitary group known as Q-37 threatened to assassinate Canada's public security minister and to bomb First Nations reserves. Police had received a tip that the Solar Temple was behind the threats. They raided the complex in Morin Heights, but were never able to get the evidence they needed to prove any wrongdoing. They found nothing tying anyone to the assassination threat. So after that investigation went nowhere, Jouret and two of his followers pleaded guilty to weapons charges. Jouret paid a $1,000 fine and was given a conditional discharge. The other two men received 6 months probation. One of the men who pleaded guilty with Jouret was a project manager from Hydro-Quebec, the province's giant public utility, which oversees billions of dollars in income and operating assets. His arrest and connection to the cult was a major concern, and it sparked fear that Hydro-Quebec had been infiltrated at the highest levels. So in response, Hydro-Quebec launched a massive investigation. The utility admitted that at least 15 employees had been members of the Solar Temple at some point, but had done so on their own time. The investigation found that Luc Jouret used Hydro-Quebec offices in 1988 and 1989 to speak to employees about things like self-fulfillment and employee productivity. But all of the meetings were done after hours. Jouret was paid about $4,000 for the training sessions. It was never made clear, though, if Hydro-Quebec paid his fees or if employees used their own money. Despite all of those findings, Hydro-Quebec concluded that there had been no wrongdoing. With the increased scrutiny in Canada after the gun charges, both Jouret and DeMambro decided to leave the country. They moved back to Switzerland. But the troubles didn't end. It seemed like the Solar Temple was running out of time. DeMambro was 70 years old and had grown quite sick, and he'd become extremely paranoid. He was consumed by the belief that the group was under surveillance by authorities. Some members started to question his leadership abilities as well. They accused him of being a fake, that he used magic tricks during ceremonies to simulate illusions and spiritual experiences. And there was also the matter of DeMambro's expensive lifestyle, which rubbed some members the wrong way. He reportedly had 4 Ferraris and a Lamborghini at one of his homes in Geneva. Many members started to believe they'd been swindled and they wanted out. They began asking for refunds of up to $50,000. With pressure growing from all sides, DeMambro, Jouret, and a fanatical inner circle of 13 members called the Awakened decided it was time to act. It was time to transition to a new life on Sirius, the brightest star in the Earth's sky. DeMambro and his inner circle believed they could only depart for Sirius after passing through a fiery death, which would purify their spirit. They believed they could instantly transport to this new, better world on Sirius by committing suicide.
The group did not sell it as suicide. People on the outside call it suicide. Members who obviously view it, differently, makes it easy. You're not going to kill yourself, which is final. You're going on a transit, which is like you're going on a voyage. So it's not an ending, but rather a continuation up to another level of existence.
Jouret and DeMambro decided if there were other members that didn't go along with the group's plan, they would have to be murdered. And before the fiery voyage to a new world could take place, there was something else that needed to be taken care of. DeMambro insisted that they must first kill an infant that he had targeted as the Antichrist. The dramatic exit plan was set in motion on September 29, 1994, when DeMambro sent 2 of his devout followers from Switzerland to Quebec. Dominique Belleton and Joel Egger were given instructions to kill a baby that DeMambro claimed was the Antichrist. 3-month-old Christopher Emmanuel Dutoit was the son of Tony and Nikki Dutoit. The couple had been members of the Solar Temple and had worked for DeMambro as a landscaper and a nanny. But they had started pulling away from the group 3 years earlier in 1991. Before they left, DeMambro forbid Nikki from having a child. And when the order was ignored, the cult leader was enraged. He believed the baby was a threat to his cosmic child, Emmanuel. The 12-year-old lived in Switzerland, and he claimed she'd been conceived by a female member without having sexual contact with him. When Belleton and Egger arrived in Quebec on September 29th, they drove to Morin Heights and met up with Jerry and Colette Ginot, 2 members of the cult who still lived in the chalet owned by the Solar Temple. They were Swiss citizens who helped come up with a plan to kill baby Christopher and his parents. On the morning of October 3rd, the Dutoit family was invited to the Morin Heights chalet under the guise of visiting Belleton, who was an old friend. But as soon as they arrived at the chalet, they were brutally attacked. I need to take a minute here and warn you that the details of what happened are pretty graphic. Nikki Dutoit was stabbed 14 times, 4 times in the throat. This is an area of the body that cult members believed was central to the birth process. Her husband, Tony, was beaten over the head with a baseball bat. His throat was slashed, and he was stabbed 50 times in the chest. Little baby Christopher was stabbed through the heart several times. There have been conflicting reports on whether the murder weapon was a knife or a wooden stake. The next day, on October 4th, Bellaton and Egger drove the Dutois' car to Montreal's Mirabel Airport and boarded a flight back to Zurich, Switzerland. Jerry and Colette Jeannot stayed behind to begin preparations for the next step in Demambro's disturbing plan. First, they cleaned the house to purify it for the transit to Sirius. Then, they connected timers to an ignition device hooked up to several containers of gasoline. Next, they consumed a strong tranquilizer, and a few hours later, when they were unconscious but still alive, the house ignited and the two went up in flames. A neighbor who believed the complex was unoccupied called the fire department. And after volunteer firefighters put out the blaze, they discovered the charred bodies of a man and a woman inside. Colette was on a bed in a second-floor bedroom. Her husband, Jerry, was found in a sitting position against a wall in the bedroom. They were both wearing solar temple medallions around their necks, which featured one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse carrying a skull and sickle. The bodies of Nikki, Tony, and baby Christopher weren't found for 2 days because one of the ignition devices had failed and the chalet unit they were in did not catch on fire. And so there was no reason for firefighters to search inside their unit initially. When they did, what they found was ghastly. Not only did they discover the bodies of Nikki and Tony, who had been brutally beaten and stabbed, but also the body of baby Christopher. There was a bag over his head, and his little body was stuffed behind a water heater. There was a small ceremonial wooden stake nearby. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, 16 hours after the fire in Morin Heights, the next part of the dramatic exit plan took place. Remote-controlled devices ignited simultaneous fires in 2 small villages. A fire in Chéry, Switzerland destroyed a garage and a barn. But something had gone wrong with one of the devices, and the farmhouse on the property was untouched. Inside, police found the body of the property owner, a 73-year-old man. He had a bag over his head, and he'd been shot. As police continued to search the house, they found handbags, suitcases, clothing, along with Swiss, French, and Canadian passports. They also noticed traces of blood on the floor. Then they found a false door leading to another room. The room appeared to be some sort of chapel. The walls were covered in red satin and mirrors. And in the center of the room, there was an altar with a golden chalice on it. There was also a portrait of Jesus hanging over the pulpit. But over the face of Jesus was a picture of Luc Jouret. On the floor, inspectors found 18 bodies arranged in a sun-like circle. Most of them were wearing ceremonial robes. Some had their hands held in prayer. 4 other bodies were found in other rooms. In total, there were 23 people dead. Some bodies had plastic bags over their heads. Some were handcuffed. 20 had been shot. 160 kilometers away in the village of Grange-sur-Salvan, fire also ravaged 2 ski chalets. There, 25 more bodies were found in the rubble. 1 was shot, the rest had been poisoned and suffocated. In the end, 48 people were found dead in Switzerland, including 7 children. Among the dead were also 7 Canadians. Robert Astigui, the 50-year-old mayor of a small town in Quebec, and his wife, 47-year-old Françoise Asseline, were found in Switzerland. Asseline flew there just days before in an effort to save her husband. Astigui had joined the Order of the Solar Temple about 3 years earlier. He had even taken a leave from his job as mayor in Richelieu to travel to Switzerland in August. He was supposed to come back in September, but Astigui called town staff 2 times to tell them he was extending his trip.
Last night, city employees lowered the flag in the small town of Richelieu, 25 kilometers south of Montreal. Inside City Hall, people were shocked. This man is convinced Ostigui was murdered. He was not the type to commit suicide, he said. André Ducharme, Global News, Montreal.
Among the other Canadians who died in Switzerland was Jean-Pierre Venet, the senior manager with Hydro-Quebec who pleaded guilty with Jouret in the weapons case years earlier. Venet's wife was also among the dead. So too was 44-year-old Jocelyn Grandmaison. She was a municipal affairs reporter for the newspaper The Journal de Quebec. Jouret and Demambro's bodies were also found along with the Canadians. Demambro died with his wife Jocelyn and 12-year-old Emmanuel by his side. Police were completely stunned by what they found. Up until then, not much was known about the Order of the Solar Temple.
At first it appeared to have been a collective suicide, then a mass execution. Now authorities say it's a combination of both. Either way, the gruesome case fulfilled Jouret's doomsday prophecy. The real explanation for the deaths may never be known.
A few days after the fire, police got some answers when 4 suicide letters were delivered to the media in Switzerland and France. A 5th letter was sent to the Ministry of the Interior in France. They were all mailed from Geneva the day of the fires and explained that members of the group had left Earth and were in transit to the star Sirius. In the letters, the group blamed constant investigations and surveillance by governments and police for the cult's mass deaths. They said, and I quote, "Faced with police intimidation that we are constantly victims of, we have decided in all consciousness to leave this world." Police eventually found out who mailed the letters, and it wasn't Demambro or Jouret. It was Patrick Varnet. He's the youngest son of the French ski legend and sunglass icon, Jean Varnet. Patrick Varnet, who was a member of the Solar Temple, said that he was handed sealed documents by Demambro only hours before the tragic events in Switzerland took place. He was given instructions to mail them the next day. Varnet's lawyer told the media that his client had no idea what the documents contained. Following a lengthy investigation, Swiss police concluded that 15 people who were part of an inner circle called the Awakened, including Jouret and Demambro, died by suicide. They consumed a powerful mixture of poison and sedatives. They apparently all believed they were leaving Earth for a better planet, and they had no fear of dying. Police said the remainder of the dead had been murdered, although they admitted some may have wanted to die with their leaders. The next chapter in this saga came in December 1995. The Order of the Solar Temple was suddenly back in the news when 16 members of the cult were reported missing. The missing included 3 children, ages 2, 4, and 6. And this time, the wife and son of French ski legend Jean Varnet. Police had reason to believe that another mass murder-suicide had happened or was about to happen. They found 4 cars belonging to the missing cult members parked near a cross-country ski center in the mountains near Grenoble, France. 500 officers were called in, and they began a frantic search through the remote forest surrounding the center. The search ended the next day with a grisly discovery.
Bullet wounds were found on all the bodies discovered yesterday, laying in star formation around a campfire in a remote clearing in the French Alps. The bodies have been transferred to the morgue in the nearby city of Grenoble for a complete autopsy beginning Tuesday. But investigators have already determined that the wounds are from 2 different caliber bullets, which are being compared with pistols and a shotgun found on the scene. The prosecutor said police also found packets of toxic chemicals and sedatives, which may have been administered to the cult members before their death. What investigators wonder now is whether the massacre was planned with the consent of the victims and whether the organizers died with the other Solar Temple adepts, or whether a mass murderer may still be at large. Sarah Chase, Global News, Paris.
Among the dead were 3 young children, along with Edith and Patrick Varnet, as well as 2 French police officers. The investigation by officials eventually determined that the group of people had been lured to the Alpine clearing by one of the officers along with another member. At 1 a.m. on December 16, 1995, the 14 members willingly left their cars in the ski resort car park. Then they walked about a mile through thick pine woods and settled down around a campfire. It's believed that the victims thought they were being called to witness an apparition of Joe DiMambro. Instead, they were drugged and shot by the two men, who then set them on fire and then shot themselves. The final chapter of this story happened in March 1997 in St. Casimir, a rural community west of Quebec City. Firefighters were called to a scene of a fire. When they arrived, they saw 3 teenagers stumbling out of a shed beside a burning house. 2 boys, aged 13 and 16, along with a girl, aged 14, appeared drugged and incoherent, and they were calling out for their father. Firefighters discovered that both of their parents and their grandmother were dead.
5 people were killed in a house fire that police believe was deliberately set by the victims, all of whom were current or past members of a doomsday cult. Police found gasoline containers and portable electric stoves in a bedroom in the home. They believe that's what sparked the blaze. The dead are believed to be this man, 39-year-old Didier Caisse, and his 41-year-old wife. They own the home. Police say the bodies were laid out in the shape of a cross with another couple's, a 49-year-old man and his 54-year-old wife. One more body was found, a 63-year-old woman, on a couch in the living room with a plastic bag over her head. She was Case's mother-in-law.
A letter was found inside the home which spoke of preparing men, women, and children for a voyage to the sky. A copy of the letter had also been sent to Montreal's La Presse newspaper. The letter indicated that this latest suicide had been planned since 1994, when the first mass deaths of Solar Temple members had occurred. It stated that all 3 departures in 1994, 95, and 97 were actually one and the same transit. The 3 teenagers who escaped the fire told police that their parents and other cult members had initially rigged propane tanks to ignite a fire a day earlier to coincide with the spring equinox. But the mechanism rigged to the tanks didn't work, and the fire wasn't lit. The parents and the other members planned to try again with the fire, and this time the teenagers begged them not to proceed. The parents gave their kids a choice: either follow them on the voyage or stay on their own. The teens decided to stay. Police said they took sleeping pills so they didn't have to watch their parents die. Then they went to sleep in the shed, which was far enough away from the house so they wouldn't be touched by the flames. The parents had been deeply involved with the Order of the Solar Temple cult when it was operating in the Laurentians, and apparently had been close friends with Luc Jouret. In response to the Solar Temple deaths, in 2001, the government of France passed Europe's toughest anti-cult legislation. It allows judges to order the dissolution of any sect whose members are convicted of a criminal offense. It also banned religious sects from advertising and recruiting new members near schools, hospitals, or retirement homes. And the legislation created a controversial new crime of mental manipulation, which is defined as exercising heavy and repeated pressure on a person to induce them to behave in a way prejudicial to their interests. The legislation was denounced by the Church of Scientology and the Unification Church. They called it fascist, anti-democratic, and a breach of basic human rights laws. In 2009, the law was used when a French court fined the Church of Scientology nearly $1 million after a couple claimed that they'd been manipulated into buying $70,000 worth of church products. France also launched an extensive investigation into the 1994 deaths. They wanted to know if there was anyone else still alive who could be held responsible for the tragedy. A 5-year investigation led police to a prominent orchestra conductor and composer, Michel Tabachnik, and he was charged with participating in a criminal association. Tabachnik, who was once considered one of France's leading classical conductors, was a friend of DeMambro's and a member of the cult during the 80s and the 90s. Prosecutors said he held a senior position in the Solar Temple, calling him DeMambro's crown prince. They essentially accused Tabachnik of brainwashing members. Court heard that the conductor encouraged members to commit suicide in various writings, which the prosecution called a, quote, demonic doctrine. In his defense, Tabachnik claimed he was naive and he had also been a victim of DeMambro. Following a 9-day trial, Tabachnik was acquitted. 3 French judges ruled prosecutors failed to prove that the orchestra conductor was criminally responsible for the deaths of 74 cult members in Europe and Canada. But French prosecutors wouldn't let it go. They appealed the ruling, and 4 years later, Tabachnik was put on trial again in France. In December 2006, the appeals court upheld his acquittal. After his lengthy legal battle, Tabachnik returned to his career. He's currently chief emeritus for the Brussels Philharmonic, where he directs several concerts per season. Very few surviving members of the Solar Temple have spoken publicly about their involvement with the group. It's safe to say they might not want to revisit that period of their life. Because of the mystery that surrounds the Solar Temple, there are many unanswered questions to this day, including why so many educated, well-off people joined the group. What were they looking for, and what were they promised? The fact that the Solar Temple attracted police, politicians, civil servants, journalists, and millionaires seems at odds with what we think of when we talk about cults. But in reality, the search for meaning in an era where there's a growing lack of trust in traditional religions crosses all socioeconomic groups. And Michael Kropfeld says almost everyone has had a period in their life when they feel more vulnerable.
No matter how bright or intelligent you may be, you may, like everyone else, go through similar kind of crises and difficulties emotionally in your life. There may be a breakup in your relationship, the death of a loved one, questions about, existential questions that come up. So at those times, you're more open. And the relationship you develop with a group is often an emotional one, which is almost like falling in love with somebody, and you hear the expression, love is blind. So in many ways, people have described their involvement in the group almost in those terms. It's almost like, wow, I found what I'm looking for. It's giving me the answers. It's responding to whatever I've been looking for. So it's emotional. So no matter how intelligent you are, there are different times in one's life where you go through dips. And at those times, at those dips, you're more open to hearing things that at other times you probably wouldn't accept or question more.
Another important unanswered question: does the Order of the Solar Temple still exist today? Well, there is no solid evidence, but of course, there's a ton of speculation and rumors that as many as a few hundred followers remain throughout the world who still believe in the teachings of Luc Jouret and Joseph DeMambro. The Order of the Solar Temple wasn't the only doomsday cult that made news in the 1990s. It seemed like every couple of years there was another harrowing story of death and destruction. So on the next episode of History of the 90s, we'll take a look at 2 more of those groups. One was responsible for a deadly attack on the Tokyo subway system, and the other orchestrated a mass suicide in a California mansion. Thanks for listening to this episode on the strange and devastating story of the Order of the Solar Temple. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to my guest, Michael Kropfeld from InfoCult. If you've got an idea for a show, please let me know. We've been getting a ton of great ideas. Please keep them coming. You can always reach me through Twitter at 1990s History. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. And you can email me directly at 90s@curiouscast.ca. That's 90s@curiouscast.ca. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, please don't forget to rate and review us. It helps spread the word and get more people to find the podcast. We're available for free always at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and everywhere else you get your streaming audio. And you can always listen at curiouscast.ca. If you're new to the show, please go back and check out some of our older episodes. This show is hosted and co-written by me, Kathy Kinzora, and Dila Velasquez, our producer. Sound design and final production is by Rob Johnston. See you next time for more history of the 90s. Akashi Shizuko was a 31-year-old seamstress turned cashier, and she was on her way to an employee training seminar. She boarded the subway car at Kasumigasaki Station, a major transfer point on the Underground Line, which would take her to her final destination in West Tokyo. But once she was on the train, she immediately collapsed into a vegetative state. I'm Kathy Kinzora, and on this episode of History of the 90s, we continue our look at the rise of doomsday cults at the end of the 20th century. Today, the story of a group in Japan that had a dangerous belief in the impending apocalypse. On March 20th, 1995, 5 men boarded separate subway trains headed for downtown Tokyo. It was the height of the morning rush hour. 9 million commuters were making their way to work. These men, all highly educated professionals, were about to carry out a deadly attack. Each carried at least 2 packages wrapped in newspaper and a long umbrella with a sharpened tip. At exactly the same time, they placed their packages on the floor and punctured them with their umbrellas. Then they ran off. Within minutes, commuters began gasping for air and collapsing as the deadly sarin gas contained inside the packages began to seep out and permeate the air. The men that were responsible for this sarin attack were members of Om Shinrikyo. The group was founded in 1984 in Tokyo, Japan, by Shoko Asahara. His real name was Chuzio Matsumoto, and he was born partially blind, the 6th of 7 children whose parents were poor shopkeepers. After failing to get into medical school, Asahara studied pharmacology and acupuncture. He eventually opened his own pharmacy, specializing in Chinese medicine. But in 1982, he was arrested for selling fake remedies, and after being convicted of fraud, his pharmacy went bankrupt. Around this time, Asahara had joined a small new religious movement called Aganshu, which was a blend of Hinduism and Buddhism. By the mid-'80s, he opened his own one-room yoga training school, which focused on using yoga and herbal medicines for healing. He drew people to the school by handing out pamphlets and preaching on street corners. In 1989, the government granted his school legal status as a certified religious organization, which he called Om Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth. Like the religious group Asahara had previously belonged to, Om based its doctrines on a combination of ancient Buddhist and Hindu beliefs, along with his own apocalyptic prophecies. Soon, Asahara began calling himself the ultimate savior, and he claimed he had supernatural powers, like ESP and the ability to levitate. He preached that he had been selected by the Hindu god Shiva to create a utopian society. At its height in the early 90s, the group reportedly had branches in 6 countries, including Japan, Russia, and the US, with as many as 40,000 followers. Nearly all of the members in Japan were in their early to mid-20s, and many had attended the country's top universities. Professor Paul Midford is director of the Japan program at the Norwegian University for Science and Technology. He says many of Om's members had become disillusioned with the pressure of Japanese society to succeed.
The members of this group were people who'd gone to elite universities and somehow had fallen out of the narrow kind of track that leads to promotion into prestige, elite government ministries or corporations, and kind of falling outside of that for one reason or another, they became alienated and were attracted to this religion and kind of brought their great skills and knowledge and brain power with them.
Many of the people who joined Ohm were sometimes called otaku, young people who were shut-ins who spent most of their free time absorbed in computers and comics. They were from a generation that grew up watching anime, and many had graduated to gekkake, which are book-length comics drawn with realistic pictures, which are often ultra-violent and depict rape, murder, and a retrograde future. Those who joined the group were required to sever all contact with their families and to donate all of their assets to the group. With the help of these young scientists and engineers, Asahara built a network of warehouses, chemical facilities, and computer firms. And by 1992, Ohm had amassed more than $1 billion. Asahara organized the cult like a government. It had about 20 ministries. The Ministry of Science ran the chemical lab. The Ministry of Food provided 2 meals a day to followers, which was seldom more than a bowl of instant noodles, 3 hard biscuits, or a bowl of boiled veggies. Actually, conditions for most members were pretty bleak.
Former cult members say new disciples are often given drugs intravenously, deprived of sleep and food, and forced to drink 2.5 gallons of hot water each day until they throw up, purging their system.
Members lived in small, cell-like rooms and were forced to take part in rituals, which included doing rapid breathing exercises and meditating with the help of a monotonous drone of devices taped to their heads. Some trainees even practiced the disciplines of staying underwater or in closed, airless spaces for prolonged periods. Anyone who tried to leave was severely punished with electric shocks. As the cult grew, the families of members raised the alarm, and complaints of kidnapping, brainwashing, and abuse within Aum Shinrikyo became more common. But no one could have predicted what the group would soon be capable of. Satsumi Sakamoto was a 33-year-old Japanese lawyer known for his work against cults. He had successfully led a class action suit against the Unification Church on behalf of relatives of its members, and he was also working on a lawsuit against Aum Shinrikyo. Sakamoto apparently was hoping to demonstrate that Aum members, similar to members of the Unification Church, which are often known as Moonies, did not join the group voluntarily, but were lured in by deception and were probably being held against their will by threats and manipulations. On October 31st, 1989, Sakamoto was successful in persuading Asahara to submit to a blood test to check for his special power that he claimed was present in his body. The results were normal, and there was no sign of anything unusual. If this were made public, it could have been embarrassing or damaging to Asahara because it was one of the ways that he lured new members in. So at 3 a.m. on November 4th, 1989, several Aum Shinrikyo members entered Sakamoto's apartment through an unlocked door. Sakamoto was struck on the head with a hammer. His 29-year-old wife was beaten. Their infant son was injected with potassium chloride, a drug usually used to cause cardiac arrest. While the two adults struggled, they were also injected with the potassium chloride. Sakamoto's wife died from the toxic injection, but Sakamoto himself did not die as quickly and was strangled. The family's remains were placed in metal drums and hidden in 3 separate rural areas, so that in case the bodies were uncovered, police might not link the 3 incidents. Police were unable to resolve the case at the time, although some of Sakamoto's colleagues publicly voiced their suspicions of the group. Their bodies weren't found until after the 1995 Tokyo subway attack, when the perpetrators revealed the locations. The murder and the growing clamor from cult members' families caused increased attention from the authorities, and feeling the mounting pressure, Ohm began preparing for the end of days by experimenting with a number of deadly chemicals. Luckily, most of their experiments failed. In 1990, the group tried to create botulinum, an extremely deadly neurotoxic chemical produced by bacteria. Members loaded the fermented chemical sludge into several spray trucks and then drove past and sprayed 2 U.S. naval bases, Narita Airport in Tokyo, a Japanese government building, and the Imperial Palace. The sludge, though, hadn't purified properly, and the neurotoxin had no effect. In 1992, Asahara led 40 Ohm followers to Zaire in an attempt to acquire Ebola samples, but their mission was unsuccessful. Ohm again tried spraying the neurotoxic chemical botulinum from a truck in June 1993. This time, the target was the elaborate wedding of Crown Prince Naruhito, who is now Japan's emperor. Like the first time, the neurotoxin was not made properly and had no effect. There were also attempts by the group to spray anthrax, but that attempt also failed, and it resulted in a large number of complaints about bad odors, but no infections. Finally, cult scientists began to focus on manufacturing sarin gas at an isolated sheep farm in Western Australia. In the summer of 1993, about 25 members of Ohm moved to the rural farm where they conducted gruesome tests on sheep and managed to kill 29 with their homemade gas. Then, on the night of June 27, 1994, the cult released clouds of sarin gas in a residential area with the help of a converted refrigerator truck. The attack took place near the homes of several judges in the central Japanese city of Matsumoto. Asahara was being sued by a landowner over a real estate dispute, and he feared he was going to lose the case. So Ohm decided to attack the 3 judges overseeing the matter. 8 people died and 500 others were injured, including the judges. As a result, they were unable to deliver a verdict in the case involving Asahara. The attack in Matsumoto also served as a test to see how efficient sarin gas was as a weapon of mass destruction. They used the residents of Matsumoto as their guinea pigs. So you might be wondering, what is sarin gas? Well, sarin is an extremely toxic, colorless, odorless gas that works on the nervous system, disrupting all bodily functions. Exposure to the chemical usually means the pupils will shrink to pinpoints, the mouth and lungs will fill with saliva and bodily fluid, and the heart will begin to slow. Some victims may experience seizures. Death usually comes very quickly.
Sarin has been called the poor man's atom bomb because it can kill just as swiftly. There are similar agents to sarin that have common uses. Malathion, for instance, is used against agricultural pests around the world. Sarin is a kind of pesticide for humans, but it kills by crippling the nervous system, making it impossible to breathe.
There is an antidote for sarin. It's called atropine, a cheap and effective medication available on all crash carts in North American hospitals. Sarin gas was developed in 1938 in Nazi Germany by a team of scientists who were looking for a better pesticide that targeted the nervous system of insects. When several of the scientists were exposed to the chemical, they became quite ill. The Nazi government heard about this, and they told the scientists to figure out a way to weaponize the chemical. However, it was never used as a chemical weapon during World War II. The first time it was used as a weapon was an attack in Halabja, one of the deadliest chemical attacks in history. Approximately 5,000 people, mostly women and children, were killed, and many others died later of cancer and other illnesses. Researchers believe the contamination passed not only into the soil and water, but into the gene pool as well. Because since the attack, an abnormal number of children have been born in this region with genetic malformations. Sarin has been used more recently in Syria, first in 2013, when, according to the United Nations, a suburb of Damascus was hit by government-backed rockets containing the deadly nerve agent. The death toll varies, but somewhere around 1,500 people died, including 500 children. Then, in 2017, the world watched in horror as sarin was unleashed in Syria again. Images of dead, poisoned children spread across the world. About 80 people, including at least 25 children, were killed. More than 300 others were injured. But back in 1994, after the successful experiment in Matsumoto, Ohm began planning what would become one of the deadliest bioterrorist attacks in history. This is the timeline of what unfolded on that fateful day in 1995. The deadly attack began at 10 minutes before 8 a.m. on March 20th, as 5 men boarded subway trains carefully selected for maximum impact. They blended in with other passengers headed for the center of Tokyo. By 8:15, all 5 converged on the district of Kasumigaseki, where most of Japan's government offices are located. Each man was carrying 2 to 3 packages wrapped in newspaper. Inside were plastic bags of liquid sarin. The men ranged from 27 to 48 years old and were all highly educated. 3 had physics degrees, 1 a degree in artificial intelligence, and the eldest was a cardiologist who had recently quit his job to join the cult. The plan was for the men to all puncture their sarin packages at exactly 8 a.m. and quickly escape the trains. They were each carrying an umbrella with a sharpened tip, and they also carried a syringe with the antidote, just in case they were exposed to the chemical. But a couple of things didn't go according to plan. The cardiologist had second thoughts and punctured just 1 package before exiting the train. There was just 1 small hole in his package, and the sarin barely leaked out. People on board that train suffered just minor poisoning, and there were no serious injuries. But on board another train, the packages were punctured effectively, and sarin gas leaked rapidly into the air. Within 2 stops, people started coughing and collapsing. Normally, sarin is odorless, but the cult scientists had not purified it properly, so it smelled like burning rubber. When the train stopped, people came pouring out onto the platform, gasping for breath. Confusion and panic filled the air. No one had any idea what was going on. Meanwhile, sarin gas was leaking from the train into the station, spreading the poison even further. Similar situations took place on the other trains. Soon, subway entrances looked like battlefields, with poisoned commuters laying on the ground, convulsing and gasping for air. Some had blood gushing from their nose and mouth. In some cases, once the trains were cleared of people, they were sent on down the line, with the deadly packages still on board. Unknowingly, the sarin gas spread even further. When workers finally found the packages, they had no idea what they were, and they brought them out onto the platform and exposed even more people. In one case, the workers who found packages took them to a small security office. While they waited for police to arrive, they too became ill from the toxic fumes. After the attack, the 5 men rendezvoused at a getaway car and then made their way through morning traffic to a hideout. One of the men had to use his syringe of antidote, but he survived. When news broke about the attack, the scenes on television were horrifying. A disturbing new reality seemed to arrive overnight. Every person in every large city suddenly felt vulnerable, as they saw commuters stumbling out of trains onto platforms, vomiting with nosebleeds, foaming at the mouth, and convulsing. No one was sure what the chemical was or who could be responsible for such terror. 13 people died as a result of the attack, and nearly 5,000 more were injured, some with permanent brain damage. Among the dead were a 76-year-old retiree, a 29-year-old man whose wife was expecting their first child in a month, a subway operator, and a station manager who died after trying to clean up the poison. Once it was determined that the poison was in fact sarin gas, experts were quick to point out that hundreds of thousands of people could have been killed if the poison had been deployed properly. In Tokyo, you see the sarin liquid was placed in plastic bottles that were wrapped in newspaper. The packages were punctured and the liquid ran out onto the floor of the subway. To be most effective, nerve gas is best delivered via aerosol spray. Experts believed this might be the beginning of a new age. This was the first significant time terrorists used a weapon of mass destruction on an urban area. Remember, this was long before terrorists flew airplanes into the World Trade Center buildings in New York. In a newspaper article 2 days after the attack, a terrorism specialist was quoted as saying, "We've definitely crossed a threshold. This is the cutting edge of high-tech terrorism for the year 2000 and beyond. It's the nightmare scenario that people have quietly talked about for years coming true." And many pointed out that society was extremely vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. Terrorists could easily poison a city's water supply or release lethal gases like sarin into sports stadiums, convention centers, or theaters. Some predicted it was just a matter of time before an attack like this occurred in North America. 2 days after the attack, police focused their investigation on Aum Shinrikyo. More than 1,000 police officers backed by a chemical warfare unit raided 24 locations linked to the cult. The main focus was their rural retreat near a mountain hamlet on the scenic slopes below Mount Fuji. Television footage showed hundreds of police in riot gear marching down a dusty road toward the cult's ramshackle collection of buildings. For many, it brought back memories of the Branch Davidian raid in Waco, Texas, that occurred 2 years earlier. But in this case, no weapons were used and no one was injured. Police cut through locked doors with power saws. Some officers even carried caged canaries to detect the presence of poison gas, a bygone technique deployed in coal mines. Once inside the main dojo, police were shocked to find about 50 cult members suffering severe malnutrition from fasting. They found one woman locked in a box. Other captives had been drugged. But 4-year-old Shoko Asahara was nowhere to be found. Before the end of the day, police seized barrels and barrels of chemicals used to make sarin, $11 million in cash, and 10 kilos of gold. They also found bottles of the antidote to sarin, gas masks, and chemical protective suits. Over the coming days, police would seize enough chemicals to make enough sarin to kill over 4 million people. Aum denied any role in the attack. They said they were being framed by the government. A spokesperson said the chemicals weren't being used to make nerve gas, they were being used to weld and process computer chips. Professor Midford was living in Tokyo at the time of the attack in 1995.
About 3 days after the attacks, somebody came through my apartment building and probably most other buildings in that area in southern Tokyo in the Otaku region where I lived, and put pro Aum Shinrikyo pamphlet in my mailbox. I remember reading that, and it talked about the JCIA, or the Japanese CIA, and claimed that they had done this to frame Aum Shinrikyo, and they were also blaming the U.S. and that sort of thing. So it was a big conspiracy theory.
Initially, police didn't publicly link the cult to the attack. They said the raids were carried out as part of other ongoing investigations against Aum. But then 5 days after the attack, Japanese police opened a murder investigation against the group. Officers raided the cult's main compound again, this time armed with a murder warrant. Inside, they found a hidden room with a highly sophisticated chemical laboratory capable of producing a large quantity of nerve gas. The secret door to the room was hidden behind a huge Hindu statue. Police also found rooms or underground containers that had been used to confine people who tried to flee the cult. Then 2 other shocking incidents took place. First, on March 28th, 8 days after the attack, Japan's top police official in charge of the investigation was shot 4 times by a masked assailant. The chief of the National Police Agency was leaving his condo on the way to work when a gunman wearing a black raincoat and a white surgical mask shot him in the shoulder, stomach, and leg. He underwent surgery and survived. The attacker had fled by bicycle, and it wasn't until a year later that an OM member and former Tokyo police officer confessed to the shooting. Then, 7 weeks after the attack on the night of April 23rd, 36-year-old Hideo Murai, OM's top scientist, was heading into OM's Tokyo headquarters. There was a huge crowd of reporters and police standing outside the building as Murai approached. Suddenly, a man broke through the crowd and began to stab and slash Murai repeatedly. Television networks broke into regular programming across the country to broadcast the attack, and footage showed a knife plunging into Murai's side. He underwent surgery at hospital, but died later from blood loss and internal injuries. The attacker called himself a right-wing extremist. He told police he wanted to punish Murai because of the trouble caused by the cult. Professor Midford said this kind of attack was not uncommon in Japan.
Japan has a history of that. A major socialist leader was stabbed to death in the early 60s. Former Ambassador Reischauer, the U.S. Ambassador Edwin Reischauer, was stabbed by a rightist in the early 60s. So there's actually kind of a history of that. A former prime minister was too, and actually a right-wing prime minister after he left office in 1960. So yeah, this sort of thing is quite common.
Nearly 2 months after the attack, Japanese police finally made their first major arrest in the case. They arrested OM's intelligence minister, Yoshihiro Inu. He was the suspected field commander in the subway attack and was taken into custody after police found a notebook in which he kept a record of timetables and numbers of passengers who used the subway lines where the sarin nerve gas was released. But still, Shoko Asahara remained at large.
Japanese authorities reportedly know the whereabouts of cult leader Shoko Asahara. Camera crews got his car without him in it on its way out of Tokyo on Saturday. But police have it closed in because they are afraid of what his followers might do. While grim-faced troops have uncovered a powerful arsenal of chemicals, enough to make 50 tons of the nerve gas used in the subway attack, they don't know if cult members have additional sarin hidden away.
Finally, on May 15, 1995, hundreds of police officers stormed OM's compound at the foot of Mount Fuji. They arrested 40-year-old cult leader Shoko Asahara and 14 other top followers and charged them in connection with the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system. Police said they found Asahara sitting in silent meditation in a hidden room beneath the third floor of the Truth Building number 6 at the cult's massive compound. The room apparently resembled a large coffin with a foam floor. Asahara, with long flowing hair and wearing a lavender robe, was put in a police van. And as he headed away along a rural highway, the entire thing was broadcast on Japanese TV networks. Some compared it at the time to the police chase of O.J. Simpson that had happened less than a year earlier. There are several theories about why OM decided to release the poison gas in the Tokyo subway system. Most center around the belief that OM wanted to provoke a world war. They believed the U.S. would be blamed for the attack, and this would lead to a full-out nuclear war between Japan and America, which would eventually bring about the end of the world. Only OM followers would survive, and they would live in a new utopian world. It took many years, but eventually 189 cult members were brought to trial in connection with the subway attack. All but one were convicted. 13 were sentenced to death, including OM leader Shoko Asahara and 4 of the attackers. The 5th attacker received a life sentence in exchange for his cooperation with the police investigation after his arrest. In July 2018, 23 years after the attack, with all appeals exhausted, Shoko Asahara and 6 other OM leaders, including the group's lead scientist and the lead chemist, were executed by hanging. Several others, including the 4 attackers, remain on death row. Despite the deadly legacy of OM Shinrikyo, the group continues to exist, but in a new way. OM splintered into 2 groups after the attack, Aleph and Hikaru Noah, also known as the Circle of Light. The government didn't disband the groups. Instead, they put them under surveillance. Professor Midford explains that Japan has a very complicated history with new religions.
So during World War II, or even before in the 1930s, when Japan really turned militarist and kind of state Shinto became almost the official religion, many new religions were suppressed, including Soka Gakkai, which is this relatively new Buddhist sect. Its leaders were imprisoned. At least one of their leaders died in prison during World War II. And because of that experience, Soka Gakkai has been very suspicious of the state, very much opposed to any kind of state authority or law that would give the state the ability to suppress or control religions.
Surveillance of the two religious sects means the authorities can conduct on-site inspections and other checks. It also means the groups must report the number of believers they have. But in 2018, the Japanese government lifted surveillance on Hikari Noa after they argued in a lawsuit that they have rejected Ohm's beliefs. They currently have about 150 members. Aleph, which remains under official scrutiny, still follows Asahara's teachings, and in fact has deepened its ties to Ohm's doctrines. According to officials, it has 1,500 members and growing. Thanks for listening to this episode on the mysterious doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo. Coming up, we'll be looking at Heaven's Gate, another doomsday cult, this one set in California. We'll take a look back at their strange story, which involves UFOs, comets, and of course, matching tracksuits and Nike running shoes. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to my guests on this episode, Professor Paul Midford. He's the director of the Japan program at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Thanks to everyone who's been sending me suggestions for show ideas. We've been getting a lot of really great ones. Everything from boy bands to stand-up comedy to 90s cartoons. Some really good stuff. So if you've got an idea, please send it my way. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me through Twitter at 1990s History. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, and you can email me directly at 90s@curiouscast.ca. That's 90s@curiouscast.ca. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd really appreciate if you could rate and review us. It will help spread the word and get more people to find this show. We're available for free at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and everywhere else you get your streaming audio. You can always listen at curiouscast.ca. And if you're new to the show, make sure you go back and check out some of our future episodes. The show is hosted and co-written by me, Kathy Kinzora, and Dila Velasquez, our producer. Sound design and final production is by Rob Johnston. See you next time for more history of the 90s. It was a beautiful day in San Diego, and 35-year-old Sheriff's Deputy Robert Brunk had every reason to think his shift would be filled with the typical calls of a beachside community. Lifeguard assists, vehicle burglaries, domestic violence, and as always, some rowdy drunks. As he got ready for his shift, the first order of business was to call into the communications center. The woman working dispatch surprised him when she said that an anonymous 911 caller had reported 40 cult members had killed themselves in Rancho Santa Fe. Brunk immediately thought it must be a prank, but he had a duty to check it out. He had no way of knowing what lay ahead. I'm Kathy Kinzora, and on this episode of History of the 90s, we continue our look at the rise of doomsday cults at the end of the 20th century. Today, the story of Heaven's Gate, the first cult of the internet era. On the 10-minute drive into Rancho Santa Fe, which is one of the highest income neighborhoods in the nation, Officer Brunk wondered how he was going to explain this visit to the homeowners. But when he pulled up to the address, he found the gate was locked. So he jumped the fence and walked up the steep driveway to the two-story mansion. Immediately, he thought something didn't look right. The lights outside the house were on, and all the blinds were drawn shut. He also noticed a number of vehicles parked in the driveway and garage. Feeling somewhat uneasy, Brunk tried the front door. It was locked. But another door on the left side of the house wasn't. He turned the knob, pushed open the door, and announced, "Sheriff's Department." That's when he recoiled from the unmistakable stench of dead bodies. Brunk immediately called for backup, and within about 10 minutes, Sheriff's Deputy Laura Gasick was on the scene. Together, they drew their guns and walked inside. As if entering a dark theater on a sunny day, Brunk's eyes slowly adjusted to the dimly lit room. The two deputies turned toward the large, pristine kitchen, where they found a side door to the garage. Inside the garage, they found a tidy row of tennis shoes and sandals. Back in the kitchen, they noticed a cockroach on its back, its legs flailing. Brunk then saw what looked like a body on top of a mattress on the floor. At that very moment, Gasick saw 6 more bodies on 3 bunk beds. Suddenly, Brunk realized they had no idea what had killed these people, and it wasn't safe to be inside the house. He looked at Gasick and said, "Let's get out of here." Outside, they set up yellow crime scene tape while waiting for investigators. When Lieutenant Jerry Lewis arrived, they went back in with guns drawn. They walked through the house, room after room, checking for life, but they found none. All they discovered was a computer screen in a side room, flashing with the words, "Red Alert." When news broke, the world was shook by the mass suicide, the creepy video messages, the obsession with UFOs, and of course, the matching Nikes. Heaven's Gate is considered in many ways as the first cult of the internet era. But before 39 members ended their lives to catch a ride on a spacecraft flying in the wake of a comet, we need to go back to Texas in the 1970s. That's where Heaven's Gate was first created by Marshall Herff Applewhite and Bonnie Lou Nettles. They met in 1972, when Applewhite's marriage of 16 years had just ended. He'd also lost his job as the chair of the music department at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, after it came to light that he had a relationship with a male student. Applewhite developed a close friendship with Bonnie Nettles, a registered nurse and mother of 4, who was also going through a turbulent time. Her marriage of 23 years had just ended, partly because of her growing belief in spirits and UFOs. Applewhite and Nettles met at either a drama class or a psychiatric facility, depending who you believe. But either way, it appears they hit it off almost immediately over their shared interest in religion, aliens, and life after death. They rarely left each other's side. The friends even picked new names. Applewhite was Doe and Nettles was T, which are notes in the musical scale, and they set out on a spiritual road trip. They traveled around the U.S. assembling a group of like-minded people. Applewhite explained to would-be followers that human bodies were merely containers or vehicles that could be abandoned in favor of a higher physical existence. They called their group the Human Individual Metamorphosis, and they preached that an extraterrestrial spacecraft would take them to the kingdom of heaven, which they referred to as the next level. Alan Warren, author of the book Doomsday Cults, says even back then, they were referred to as a UFO cult.
They sort of had the idea that we all came from another planet and that we all came from aliens, and so we had to return to them somehow in the future. And so it was kind of a worshiping of ancient aliens sort of in a raw way. And that's where it started. But of course, it went much further than that.
In September 1975, they visited a small Oregon town to give a lecture about how UFOs were soon going to make contact with the human race. About 150 people attended the event, but most people in town thought it was just a joke. That is, until shortly after the lecture, when 20 people from the town disappeared. The mysterious story was even covered by the New York Times and Walter Cronkite, the anchorman for CBS Evening News. He said it's a mystery whether they've been taken on a so-called trip to eternity or simply been taken. Turns out they'd gone to a meeting a few states over in Grand Junction, Colorado. There they were joined by about 400 other people who were expecting to rendezvous with aliens. As you might expect, the aliens were a no-show. After that, the group adopted the name Heaven's Gate, and they made an effort to stay out of the news. They quietly traveled and spread their message as they picked up new followers until they eventually settled in Southern California. When Bonnie Nettles died in 1985 from cancer, Marshall Applewhite carried on without her, getting members ready for the next level. He said the next level was a place without gender, and to prepare for that, members had some strict rules they needed to follow while they were on Earth. No sex, no human-level relationships, and no socializing. To ensure the men remained celibate, they were often encouraged to be castrated. In fact, according to a Newsweek article in 1997, Applewhite and 6 followers voluntarily traveled to Mexico City to have the surgical procedure carried out. The group also adopted an androgynous look. Both men and women kept their hair cropped close, and the members routinely wore baggy, oversized shirts, which they didn't tuck in. People who joined the cult were expected to abandon their family and turn over all of their monetary possessions. They were also instructed to cleanse their bodies from alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, fast food, and impure sexual thoughts. They did this with the Master Cleanse. You might have heard of it because it's sometimes popular for weight loss. It's when you drink nothing but a mix of lemonade, cayenne pepper, and maple syrup. Heaven's Gate members would do it for up to 3 months at a time. The group's main philosophy took its roots from Applewhite's Presbyterian upbringing and blended it with his extraterrestrial and sci-fi beliefs. You see, Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles were huge fans of Star Trek and Close Encounters, and they mixed in as many Trekkie references and symbols as possible into their new beliefs. Applewhite told his followers that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ, and that they were all living in the end times. He also preached that God was an alien, and Mary had actually been taken on board a spaceship and impregnated with Jesus. 2 major things happened in the 90s that changed the course of this bizarre but seemingly harmless organization. The first was the internet. Applewhite was quick to realize it would be a great tool for the group to share their beliefs with a wider audience, because they wouldn't have to rely on knocking on doors and handing out pamphlets on street corners.
Contrary to internet etiquette, the group used a technique known as spamming, sending the same message to scores of special interest bulletin boards. Among the bulletin board topics, abuse recovery, anarchism, blasphemy, alien visitors, and support groups for those who had left cults.
They also discovered they could use the internet to make a living. Here's Alan Warren.
Their core group members, there's about 30 of them that were working at designing websites for money. So that was their income. And that was quite a bit of income back in those days, because that was an expensive undertaking to actually build and design a website in the later 90s. So they did okay.
Actually, there are reports they earned as much as $400,000 a year with the company they called Higher Source. And they designed websites for businesses like the Beverly Hills Polo Club, a local topiary company, and a Christian music store. Heaven's Gate used the money to take out full-page ads in publications, including USA Today, to attract new members. And according to a New York Times article in 1997, the group paid to broadcast about a dozen homemade videotapes via satellite. The second important thing that happened in the 90s was the discovery of the Hale-Bopp comet. 2 astronomers first spotted the unusually bright comet on July 23, 1995. It was most spectacular in the northern hemisphere and visible to the naked eye for about 18 months. As part of its 4,000-year orbit of the Sun, the comet would be closest to Earth in March 1997. in what was one of the most impressive astronomical events of the 20th century. Applewhite took this as a sign of the end times, and he was convinced that there was a spaceship hidden behind the comet. A spaceship that was coming to pick up members of the Heaven's Gate cult to finally take them to the next level. Initially, members were told they could hitch a ride on the spaceship without committing suicide. Applewhite said they could be beamed up into space and take their bodies with them to the next level. But Applewhite eventually amended that by saying they would be given a new body in the next level, so their earthly bodies didn't have to go with them. They could die and leave them behind. To prepare for the arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet and the spaceship that followed, Heaven's Gate rented a mansion on a palm tree-lined street in Rancho Santa Fe in October 1996. They paid $7,000 a month for the 7-bedroom Mediterranean-style villa with a red clay-tiled roof in the upscale San Diego suburb. Applewhite tried to attract some new members by posting messages on their website about their plans to jump on board the spaceship headed toward Earth. He also famously recorded videos. You might remember the footage. It shows the 65-year-old speaking in a Mr. Rogers-type voice, staring wide-eyed and unblinking into the camera.
This is a very exciting time for us. Planet Earth about to be recycled. Your only chance to survive or evacuate is to leave with us. I hope for your sake that you at least ponder this, that you go into the privacy of your closet. Don't ask your neighbors, your friends, what they think of this.
And so the countdown to their deaths began on March 19th, 1997, when Applewhite recorded an exit message.
And let me say that our mission here at this time is about to come to a close in the next few days. We came from distant space and even what some might call somewhat of another dimension. And we're about to return from whence we came.
The video, which is still available on YouTube, is over 90 minutes long. About halfway through it, Applewhite turns the camera on several members. He introduces them as they stand silently staring into the lens. They all have short hair, and they're dressed in matching black uniforms with a triangle patch on the sleeve.
Now, if you would hold your patch, maybe we can zoom in on the patch. Great. See, turn it the other way a little bit. No, the opposite way a little bit. There you go. Now we don't have, there we go. See, it says Heaven's Gate Away Team. And that's exactly what that means to us. We've been away and now we're going back.
Did you catch that? The patch reads Heaven's Gate Away Team. That's a direct reference to Star Trek. On the TV show, the Away Team was a small group of crew members who descended from their spaceship to engage in some kind of activity on a planet's surface. The next day, on March 20th, a second video was made which showed all but one member making their own exit messages. The members appear on screen 2 at a time as they sit on white plastic chairs in the backyard of the mansion.
Well, I just want to let everyone know how lucky and happy I feel to be here, and let you know that what we're about to do is certainly nothing to think negatively about. We're all choosing of our own free will, go to the next level, team go.
You can hear birds chirping in the background as each person calmly describes what the upcoming voyage means to them. Yes, they're calm, but they do seem a little bit worried about how their deaths will be portrayed.
When we leave, I know the media will treat this, unless we leave in a craft and no vehicles, no bodies are left behind, it's some sort of weird, bizarre cult, suicide cult, whatever you might want to call it. But look deeper than the words. Look for what we've taught people and the message we've left behind.
On the afternoon of March 21st, Heaven's Gate members went out for a big group meal, a final supper of sorts. They gathered at the Marie Callender's restaurant in Carlsbad, California, for turkey pot pies, cherry cheesecake, and iced tea with lemon. The general manager of the restaurant took notice of the large group. Hard not to, when there are 39 individuals all wearing matching long-sleeve button-down shirts and pants. Because of their shaved heads, he thought maybe they were a group of cancer patients. A waitress who served the group said they didn't act weird. In fact, she said they were very nice. They stayed at the restaurant for about 45 minutes and paid the $350 bill in cash. Then, 3 days later, on March 24th, the deaths began. 15 people killed themselves by mixing strong barbiturates into applesauce or pudding. They washed it down with vodka. After consuming the drugs, they tied plastic bags on their heads. They lay down in bed and waited to die. The remaining members neatly arranged the bodies of the first group. Each one lay on a bed, their faces and torsos covered by a shroud made of purple material. Just the bottom of their legs and feet were visible. They were all dressed identically in baggy black track pants and black Nike Legend running shoes. Each person had exactly $5.75 in their pocket, a $5 bill and 3 quarters. And there was a packed suitcase beside their bed. The next day, on March 25th, the second wave of deaths. 15 more took their lives. It's believed that Marshall Applewhite was among this group. The surviving members arranged the bodies in the exact same way as the day before. The final 9 died on March 26th. The last 3 people from that group were the only ones who did not have purple shrouds over their bodies. There was no one left to take care of this last detail. In total, 39 people were dead, 21 women and 18 men. It was the worst ever mass suicide on American soil.
Today, San Diego authorities performed the grim task of removing 39 bodies from the exclusive hillside mansion. It appears, say investigators, members of a cult-like religious group who called each other angels committed mass suicide, forever to be remembered as angels of death. The bodies lying on their backs, hands by their sides, men and women, 2 of them black, 1 or 2 Hispanic, the rest white, ranging in ages from 20 to 72.
Among the dead, a career postal worker who abandoned his 5 children to join the cult. A troubled teenager who ran away to join the group after hearing them lecture in a park. The daughter of a retired judge. The son of a major telecommunication executive. Amongst the dead was Thomas Nichols, the younger brother of Nichelle Nichols. Star Trek fans will recognize that name. She played the role of Lieutenant Uhura, the communications officer of the USS Enterprise on the original TV show and the subsequent movies. The Heaven's Gate mass suicide was a horrible tragedy. 39 people lost their lives. But that didn't stop comedians and others from making jokes about the bizarre incident. One website riffed on Nike's slogan. Instead of "just do it," it said, "we just did it." Another spoofed the cult members by coming up with a catchphrase for their website company: "We kill ourselves working for you." David Letterman delivered one of his top 10 lists. Signs you're in a bad cult. Cult website is called www.nutcase.com. And Saturday Night Live did a parody commercial for Keds shoes that used news footage of the dead cult members wearing their Nikes. The tag for the joke: Keds, worn by level-headed Christians. After the laughter died down and people moved on, the mansion was torn down. The name of the street it was on was changed, and Heaven's Gate settled into its place as a bizarre footnote in 90s history. Remember those black Nike shoes that the cult wore? They were part of a line called Decades. Apparently, Applewhite purchased them because he thought they looked good and because he got a good deal on them. The group paid just under $550 for all 39 pairs from a store in North County in the San Diego area. Well, this was an endorsement that Nike certainly didn't want, and after the tragic events, Nike discontinued the line. To this day, its sole comment on the suicides was made in a statement to Adweek after the SNL skit in 1997. Nike referred to the deaths as a tragedy and that they had nothing to do with Nike. Ironically, though, by pulling the shoes from their lineup, Nike turned them into a highly prized collector's item, and they've been spotted on eBay for as much as $6,000. It's also interesting to note that not all of Heaven's Gate followers died in 1997. Between 6 and 8 members were left behind to preserve the cult's digital legacy. Some have since died, but there are reportedly 2 people left who have continued to maintain the group's website. Heavensgate.com has been mostly untouched since 1997 and has a perfectly preserved retro vibe. It gives information about the Heaven's Gate cults and includes Bible verses along with writings by Applewhite and a photo of how a member of the next kingdom might appear. It looks like an X-Files style alien with a large forehead and big bug eyes. The website includes written versions of the exit statements recorded by Applewhite and members, along with a media release they issued about their own mass suicide. It's widely known that the website administrators will answer emails and letters from people who'd like to learn more about Heaven's Gate. I had a couple of questions myself as I was researching this episode, so I decided to send an email through the site's contact page. They responded in less than 8 hours. I wanted to know how they distributed their videotape messages, since there was no YouTube in 1997. And here's what they said in response. We sent it out to every media station in the country and many around the world. We sent it to every pastor, minister, evangelist, pope, and other religious leaders. We sent it to every federal politician and President Clinton. We posted how to get it free on the website. Copies went out everywhere. That answer seems like an exaggeration to me. I mean, I can't imagine they sent it to every media station in the country and all religious leaders. But hey, the fact that they even responded to me is pretty crazy. By all accounts, the administrators appear to be a couple named Mark and Sarah King. They had been members of Heaven's Gate for about 12 years before the mass suicide in 1997. In an interview with Reddit's blog Upvoted in 2017, the site's administrators said that Marshall Applewhite and the other Heaven's Gate members will return to Earth at some point, and anyone who is ready may have an opportunity to join them. Thanks for listening to this episode on the strange and deadly Heaven's Gate cult. In the next episode, our final part on 90s doomsday cults, we'll dive into the story of the Branch Davidians and their fiery deaths in Waco, Texas. Be sure to check out the show notes for a link to my guest on this episode, author Alan R. Warren. His book is called Doomsday Cults, The Devil's Hostages. Thanks again to everyone who's been sending me suggestions for show ideas. Lots of great stuff. Please keep them coming. You can reach me through Twitter at 1990s History. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. And you can email me directly at 90s@curiouscast.ca. That's 90s@curiouscast.ca. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, feel free to leave us a nice review. It helps spread the word and get more people to find the show. We're available for free at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and everywhere else you stream audio. And you can always listen at curiouscast.ca. This show is hosted and co-written by me, Kathy Canzora, and Dila Velasquez, our producer. Sound design and final production is by Rob Johnston. See you next time for more history of the 90s. On a cold, drizzly morning, an 80-vehicle convoy, which included 2 trucks hauling cattle trailers, barreled down a dusty road in central Texas. As they approached their destination, ATF agent Pete Maston, dressed in full battle gear, peered through a slit in the canvas that concealed him and his colleagues. It was eerily quiet outside. There was no one around. Suddenly, the front door of the main building opened. a man with long dark hair and glasses yelled something and then slammed the door shut. What happened next is highly contested to this day. I'm Kathy Kenzora, and on this episode, the final part in our series on the rise of doomsday cults at the end of the 20th century. Today, I want to tell you how an attempt to serve a search and arrest warrant turned into a 51-day siege that ended in tragedy. This is the story of the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians are synonymous in many ways to David Koresh, but they actually existed long before him. They were founded by Victor Houteff in 1930 as an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian religious movement that believes in the second coming of Christ, and they currently have about 19 million members worldwide. Houteff joined the Seventh-day Adventists after moving to the U.S. from Bulgaria, but he disagreed with certain aspects of their theology, and he felt they weren't conforming to the teachings of the church. He suggested some reforms and was kicked out. That's when Houteff formed a group he called the Davidians. As a first step, he bought a 77-acre piece of property near Waco, Texas. He called it Mount Carmel, after the biblical mountain of the same name in northern Israel, and he moved with his followers to the semi-communal farm and compound. There they would await the apocalypse and the return of the Messiah, after which he said they would build the divine kingdom. But things sort of fell apart for the Davidians after Houteff died in 1955. There was a leadership struggle between his wife Florence and a follower named Benjamin Roden. Florence eventually left Mount Carmel, relinquishing power to Roden, who began calling the group the Branch Davidians. When Roden died in 1978, his wife Lois took over. So Lois was the leader when, in 1981, a young drifter by the name of Vernon Howell showed up at the Branch Davidians. Howell was a wannabe rock musician who had grown up a troubled child of an unwed teenage mother in Dallas. According to an article in the Smithsonian Magazine, he was severely abused by his mom's violent alcoholic boyfriend. Howell also had a learning disability and was bullied at school. He eventually dropped out of high school and became a born-again Christian. Then he joined the Southern Baptist Church, but eventually he switched to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. There he became infatuated with the pastor's daughter and aggressively pursued her. That led to him being expelled from the church. And that's when 23-year-old Vernon Howell found the Branch Davidians. Howell claimed he had the gift of prophecy, and he knew the Bible inside and out. In fact, he said he memorized the Old and New Testaments by the time he was 18. And as a result, he could quote scripture for just about anything. In 1984, at the age of 26, he married his first wife. Rachel Jones was 14 years old at the time, and she was the daughter of two fellow followers. They soon had two children, a boy they named Cyrus and a girl called Star. The charismatic young man rose up the ranks of the Branch Davidians, which was still controlled by Roden's wife, Lois. But sensing trouble, Lois's adult son, George, put a stop to Howell's ascent by kicking him out of the Branch Davidians, along with anyone who was loyal to him. Then on the morning of November 3rd, 1987, Howell and 7 of his followers crawled onto the Mount Carmel property, dressed in camouflage and combat boots, with charcoal smeared on their faces and their arms. They were armed with military-style rifles and shotguns. They were there as part of a plan to take over the compound so Howell could assume control of the Branch Davidians. Details are kind of sketchy, but we do know there was an exchange of gunfire that lasted for several minutes, and it left George Roden, who is now the leader, slightly wounded. In the end, Howell was successful, and he stepped in as the new leader of the Branch Davidians. Shortly after the takeover, Howell looked to the biblical kings David and Koresh and legally changed his name to one that would forever be associated with violence and death. He became David Koresh. As leader of the Branch Davidians, David Koresh claimed he was the Lamb of God from the book of Revelation. He said he was the only one who could open the 7 seals and set in motion events that would end mankind and propel his followers to heaven. Koresh told believers that the apocalypse was imminent and that God had willed the Branch Davidians to build an army of God. His followers were searching for meaning in their lives. They were mostly in their 20s and 30s and came from middle-class backgrounds. And in Koresh, they found the answers they were looking for. They believed he was the chosen one and would lead them through the upcoming apocalyptic battle into heaven.
You have to understand, these people believe that God has various incarnations as the Word. And David Koresh, who was the latest incarnation of the Word, that meant in some sense he was God. So if he told people anything, they cooperated with him.
That's Dick Rivas. He's a retired journalist and professor who was working at the Texas Monthly magazine during the standoff at Waco. He wrote one of the definitive investigative books about the siege called The Ashes of Waco. Rivas says Koresh controlled everything. Former followers have said that he instructed them what to wear, where they could sleep, and what they could eat. In fact, sugar, processed flour, and dairy products were all forbidden. And if those extensive rules weren't enough, the living conditions inside the compound were pretty bare bones.
The best description comes from Steve Schneider, Koresh's right-hand man, who said it was like camping indoors. And you say they had electricity, but they didn't have any heating or anything like that. No air conditioning. They had no running water. They had to get it from a well. And it was a ramshackle building anyway. So I think camping indoors is a pretty good description.
Koresh prophesied that he would have 24 children who would play an integral part of the end times. They were meant to be the 24 elders mentioned in the book of Revelation, the ones who witnessed the Last Judgment. In order to produce those children, he mandated that his male followers become celibate, even those who were married, and he took multiple wives from the ranks of his followers. Some of his wives were girls as young as 12 years old. Rivas says Koresh believed his actions were justified.
I'm telling you the things they said. My opinions aren't entering in. But they said if you look at the Bible, when a girl is physically capable of becoming a mother, she's an adult. He could have been arrested for that because it's statutory rape. But the thing was, none of the parents of those children would complain. And the local child welfare authorities knew what was going on, but they couldn't get a complaint.
Child welfare authorities also heard rumors of child abuse inside the compound, that children were being struck with a wooden paddle known as the helper when they misbehaved. But just like with the sex abuse allegations, authorities didn't have the evidence they needed to step in. In May 1992, authorities were tipped off by a UPS driver who regularly delivered ammo, gun parts, and chemicals to Mount Carmel. He became unnerved when hollowed-out grenades spilled out of a torn box in his delivery truck. You see, because Koresh believed the apocalypse was coming, he felt it was necessary to prepare by stockpiling weapons. But there was something else going on, too. Some of the members were converting AR-15s to fully automatic weapons, and that's illegal. They were also selling them at gun shows as a way to make money for the organization. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF, soon discovered that the Branch Davidians had purchased nearly 60 assault rifles and parts to build many more. They also had purchased 11 pistols, hundreds of magazines, night vision gear, and 120,000 bullets. By the fall of 1992, the chief federal prosecutor in Waco reviewed the ATF's findings and concluded there was probable cause for a search warrant for federal weapons violations. But they wanted more evidence, so they sent agents on an undercover operation. The agents posed as college students and moved into a farmhouse across the road from the Mount Carmel compound. They watched the Branch Davidians, who in turn started watching them. The operation wasn't so undercover after all. Koresh was well aware he was under surveillance. At the same time that the ATF was keeping an eye on the compound, a local newspaper, the Waco Tribune-Herald, was working on an investigative series about Koresh. The ATF asked the paper to hold off on publishing until after a raid took place, but the paper refused. So on Saturday, February 27th, the paper ran an article with the headline, "The Sinful Messiah." It included allegations from former members that Koresh had physically and psychologically abused children and had at least one underage wife. It also criticized authorities for not taking action to protect the children and bring Koresh to justice. Under mounting pressure, the ATF finally decided it was time to act. They believed that a surprise raid would be the best way to move in and take the weapons without casualties. But the ATF weren't aware that the group had already been tipped off. They knew about the raid. Koresh and his followers were armed and ready for a gunfight with agents. As the ATF made their final preparations, they were told Koresh knew they were coming. But with the plan already in motion, they decided not to call it off. ATF agents would go on to testify in court and at congressional hearings that on February 28, 1993, as they stepped out of the cattle trailers, they heard pop, pop, pop as bullets flew past them and kicked up dirt. They say they saw muzzle flashes in 2 upstairs windows and started firing back. Branch Davidians say they did not shoot their weapons until they were fired at first. And right after the raid, ATF agent Roland Ballesteros told an investigator that a fellow agent may have in fact fired the first shot when he killed a dog outside the compound. The agent later retracted the statement, though, and said it was the Branch Davidians who shot first. Either way, before the day was over, 10 people were dead, 4 agents and 6 Branch Davidians. Dozens were injured in the chaotic firefight, including David Koresh, who had been shot in the side. Much of the raid was videotaped by a cameraman who was on the scene. He had been tipped off about the ATF operation by his girlfriend, who was an ambulance dispatcher. Dan Maloney and reporter John McLemore followed the caravan of ATF agents onto the compound, expecting to document a typical seizure of illegal weapons. Instead, they documented the 60-minute gunfight and witnessed one of the most ferocious gun battles in American law enforcement history. You might remember some of the footage. Maloney and McLemore captured Agent Bill Buford, a former Green Beret, leading a team of agents up ladders and onto the roof so they could access a second-floor window. This is where they believed the guns were stored. Once Buford went through the window, though, he saw mostly empty rows of gun racks. That's when Buford says gunfire exploded through the walls and floors. The dramatic video footage shows him crawling back out the window and falling from the roof to the ground. Buford had been hit in the hip. 3 other agents were mortally wounded. After a ceasefire was called, the cameraman and reporter volunteered their Ford Bronco to transport 3 wounded agents to safety, including Buford, who was laid down wrapped in a blanket across the front hood of the vehicle. Maloney and McLemore were considered heroes, but only for a short time. The next day, on March 1st, ATF agents defended the botched raid.
The main problem we had, I don't believe, is that we were outmaneuvered or outplanned. The problem we had is that we were outgunned.
Despite the defense of the raid, later that day, the ATF was relieved of its duty. The FBI took command and continued negotiations. By now, officials were also partly blaming Maloney and McLemore for the disastrous operation. It seems that the morning of the raid, when they were on their way to the compound, they had stopped and asked for directions, and that may have tipped off the Davidians. From inside the Branch Davidian compound, Koresh's right-hand man, Steve Schneider, called the local radio station.
Nobody in this group has ever harmed or hurt anybody ever, for no reason. Not David Koresh, not anybody here. I mean, it was such a shock to all of a sudden hear this bang, bang, bang. It's just, rapid fire, and it was coming from all over.
Within 24 hours, 14 children came out of Mount Carmel. Over the next 4 days, another 7 were released. But all of Koresh's children remained inside. He refused to send them out. Instead, he made videos explaining his beliefs and sent those out to agents. In one, Koresh is seen sitting on the floor with his back against a wall, wearing a white tank top and looking thin and unkempt. Next to him is a young woman. They both have children on their laps as Koresh announces that he wants to introduce the world to his family. Then a parade of toddlers and babies comes into the frame. Some of the children even wave at the camera. Then they are joined by 2 other young women. Koresh looks at the camera and says, "This is my family, and no one is going to come in on top of my family and start pushing my family around. It's not going to happen." Koresh then puts on a pair of aviator glasses and continues.
I'm the kind of guy that I'll stand in front of a tank. You can run over me, but I'll be biting one of the tracks. No one's going to hurt me or my family. That's American policy here. You could have arrested me any day as I jogged up and down this road. You could have arrested me going to town or going to Walmart. Waco was going to bear witness against the ATF. And I did not appreciate it, and never will I ever appreciate somebody coming here with 2 helicopters and cow trailers and all that, and pushing people around with guns. Hey, I'll meet you at the doorstep any day. And somebody will get hurt. If you want to keep playing that game, I'm talking to you. Somebody's going to get hurt.
Eventually, the FBI struck a deal with Koresh. They said he could make a recording laying out his beliefs that would be broadcast on national TV and radio. Once it was played, Koresh would lead his followers out of the complex.
I, David Koresh, agree upon the broadcasting of this tape to come out peacefully with all the people.
The statement lasted 58 minutes, during which Koresh spoke in a sing-song voice about biblical history.
So that all who would break the law of God, who would seek God for forgiveness of heart, had to bring a lamb, something innocent, and slay it.
After the message played, Koresh did not hold up his end of the bargain.
God told him not to come out, and apparently God didn't explain why. And I have never been able to decide how much of David Koresh was sociopath and how much was believer, meaning it is possible that he thought he heard God tell him that, but it's also possible he just made it up because he didn't want to come out.
By now, the FBI had assembled what is thought to have been the most powerful military force assembled against American civilians. According to The New Yorker, they brought in 10 Bradley tanks, 2 Abrams tanks, 4 combat engineering vehicles, and nearly 900 law enforcement officials from various agencies. On March 9th, 10 days into the standoff, the on-scene commander decided to raise the stakes and cut electricity to the buildings. They also tried to force the Davidians out of the compound by shining bright lights through the night and blasting music and odd sounds like dentist drills, Tibetan chants, and screaming rabbits being slaughtered. In the years since the standoff, experts have suggested that the federal agents didn't really comprehend the extent of the Davidians' religious zeal, or the fact that violence from authorities only confirmed their belief in the impending apocalypse. Dick Rivas agrees.
The FBI and the ATF both are used to surrounding the houses of criminals with 20 agents, and then they holler through a megaphone, "We've got you surrounded. Surrender." And your typical drug dealer or any other hoodlum calls his lawyer on the cell phone. The lawyer says, "Surrender." Right? But they were dealing with a group of people who thought that they were the army of Babylon. And the Bible tells them to defend the faith. So they did.
Not long after the siege began, James Tabor, a biblical scholar and an expert on the types of beliefs shared by the Branch Davidians, heard Koresh talking on CNN about the 7 seals. He was concerned that both the FBI and the media had very little understanding of what they were dealing with. Tabor and Philip Arnold, another religious scholar, contacted the FBI and offered to assist with negotiations. The FBI turned them down. Rivas and others have also taken issue with the way the Davidians were portrayed in the media during the standoff. Every day during the siege, the FBI held live news conferences that focused on the narrative that Koresh was a crazy cult leader, abusing children and stockpiling weapons. The media picked up on the narrative and ran with it, leaving little room for any empathy for his followers. They too were painted with the same brush. Crazy cult members who deserved what they got. Towards the end of March, the FBI allowed Koresh to meet with his attorney, and they came up with a new plan. Koresh promised that he would exit the compound after he had written his interpretation of the 7 seals referenced in the Book of Revelation. By now, the FBI had run out of patience. They figured it was another empty promise from Koresh, so they turned to Attorney General Janet Reno. They cited ongoing reports of child abuse and feared of a Jonestown-style mass suicide. They asked for permission to use tear gas to flush out Koresh and his followers. With the approval of President Bill Clinton, Reno gave them the green light. As the sun rose on the 51st day of the standoff, an FBI agent made a phone call to the Mount Carmel compound. Steve Schneider picked up the phone on April 19, 1993. He was told an FBI tactical operation was about to begin, but it was not an assault. Schneider hung up the phone and threw it out the window. Then the agent got on the loudspeaker and issued a warning.
David, individuals inside the Branch Davidian compound. We are in the process of placing tear gas into the building. Exit the compound now. Submit to the proper authority, David.
Then modified tanks moved toward the complex. They rammed holes in the walls of the sprawling building. The tanks were equipped with a gas generator that sprayed a fine mist of tear gas into the building. The FBI would later insist they did not throw highly flammable tear gas grenades into the building. David Thibodeau was inside the compound when the agents stormed in. It's his biography that the recent Netflix miniseries on Waco is based on. He says a tank came in through the front doors and just blew everything back. The attack continued for hours, spraying more and more tear gas into the building, but no one came out. Around noon, 4 hours into the operation, a set of fires broke out within the compound. Aided by strong winds, the blaze moved quickly, engulfing everything in flames. The Davidians were trapped. Only 9 people managed to escape. David Thibodeau was one of them. 75 others died, including 25 children. Many died from smoke and carbon monoxide inhalation. Others were buried alive in a concrete bunker which collapsed in the basement. And 5 children and 12 adults died from gunshot wounds, including David Koresh, who was shot in the forehead. His body was found in the communication room on the first floor of the building, near the door. A rifle was found on the floor near his body. Steve Schneider died of a gunshot wound to the mouth. His body was also found in the communication room. Charges and countercharges followed the incident, from congressional hearings to court cases. How the fire started and whether federal agents or the Davidians were responsible for the deadly outcome was hotly contested. At congressional hearings in 1993 and again in 1995, officials stressed that all forms of tear gas used against the sect were not incendiary. Attorney General Janet Reno testified in 1993 that she wanted and received assurances that the gas and its means of use were not pyrotechnic, meaning they could not have started the fires. Recordings were also released that were made by listening devices that had been placed in the compound by the FBI. They're basically snippets of conversations among Davidians that sound like they're talking about lighting fires. The transcripts provided by authorities read like this: "Need fuel. Do you want it poured? Have you poured it yet? David said we have to get the fuel on. You have to spread it all, so get started, okay?" And in another damning piece of evidence against the Davidians, an overhead aerial infrared camera showed that the fires started simultaneously at 3 different locations around the building. But this evidence didn't stop conspiracy theorists and others who believed the FBI was to blame. And then in a shocking turn of events, in August 1999, 6 years after the deadly siege, the FBI reversed its position and admitted agents had in fact fired a very limited number of potentially incendiary tear gas cartridges into the complex. The admission came after Danny Coulson, a former FBI senior official, told a Dallas newspaper in an interview that 2 devices, known as CS tear gas grenades, were fired at the complex around 6 a.m., and they were used with permission from supervisors. 2 days after that interview, the FBI confirmed what Coulson said was true, but they maintained that none of their munitions started any of the fires because flames broke out hours after the cartridges were fired. As a result of this new admission by the FBI, Attorney General Reno ordered a special counsel investigation into the FBI's actions to determine once and for all who was to blame for the tragic ending. In his final report released in July 2000, John C. Danforth, a former Republican senator, concluded that the FBI did not start the fire that destroyed the compound. He told a crowded news conference, "We are certain, and I give you these conclusions with 100% certainty. The blame rests squarely on the shoulders of David Koresh." The report concluded that FBI agents fired 3 tear gas grenades at a construction pit about 75 yards from the living quarters hours before the fires and did not contribute to them. Danforth said that Janet Reno and other high-ranking government officials had not known about the use of grenades. But he did criticize FBI officials for not coming clean sooner about the pyrotechnic canisters because it fueled lingering suspicions about the siege. He said the American people did not receive the openness and candor that they deserved in response to this tragedy. The Waco tragedy became something of a rallying cry for those who were concerned about unlawful government overreach. For right-wing militias and patriot groups, Waco was evidence that the federal government is a threat and proof that a tyrannical, illegitimate government was prepared to kill its own people. For them, the Waco siege, along with what happened in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, were defining moments. A year earlier, in the summer of 1992, things went horribly wrong when ATF agents and U.S. Marshals went to Ruby Ridge to arrest right-wing activist Randy Weaver for selling illegal weapons. Weaver had taken his family to live in a remote cabin instead of showing up to court to face weapons charges. U.S. Marshals, who were monitoring Weaver and his family, ultimately got into a firefight with him, a friend, and Weaver's 14-year-old son. It resulted in the death of both a U.S. Marshal and the 14-year-old son. The gunfight prompted an 11-day standoff before Weaver and his friend surrendered. During the standoff, an FBI sniper attempted to hit the 2 men. Instead, though, he shot and killed Weaver's wife as she held the couple's 10-month-old child. The actions by agents at Ruby Ridge and at Waco outraged militia groups and other fringe segments of society. Timothy McVeigh was one of those drawn to Waco. In fact, the Army veteran had been worried about what he saw at Ruby Ridge and went down to Waco to sell pro-God and anti-government stickers and witness the siege. Then, 2 years later, in 1995, in Oklahoma City, he was responsible for one of the worst acts of homegrown terrorism as he bombed a government building, in part as a direct response to Waco. The ironic thing is, Koresh and the Branch Davidians actually had no links to any of those movements. Here's Dick Rivas.
They are not right-wing or left-wing or anything like that. They're Davidians. And all the gun rights people take them as heroes. And it doesn't make sense. David, of course, was a gun nut. All Texas rednecks are. And they bought up AR-15s, partly because in case the army of Babylon ever attacked them, but also to sell. So, how do you say, they weren't gun rights people, they were profiteers.
Since Ruby Ridge and Waco, the ATF and FBI have handled other standoffs very differently. In 1996, a group called the Montana Freemen started a standoff with federal officials rather than get evicted from a foreclosed ranch. This time, the FBI waited them out. The confrontation lasted 81 days, 30 days longer than Waco, and this time, everybody walked out. Nobody was harmed. And this new playbook was used again in 2014 in Oregon when Cliven Bundy and other protesters occupied a federal wildlife refuge. It also ended peacefully after a 41-day standoff. After the siege in Waco ended, 8 members of the sect were convicted on charges of voluntary manslaughter and using firearms in the commission of a crime. By 2007, all had been released from prison. Some survivors of the group stayed in the Waco area and remained devout, like Clive Doyle and Sheila Martin. Doyle lost his daughter in the blaze, while Martin lost her husband, Wayne, a Harvard-educated lawyer, and her 4 eldest children. They believe that at the end of days, Koresh and their loved ones will all be resurrected as martyrs. A new group of Davidians, who were not followers of Koresh, have built a chapel on the site of the former compound. This sect, which calls itself Branch, the Lord Our Righteousness, is led by Charles Pace, who is originally from Collingwood, Ontario. He's a former follower of Lois Rodin, who initially parted ways with the group after Koresh came to power. Thanks for listening to this look back at the lasting and complicated legacy of the Branch Davidians and the siege at Waco, Texas. This is the 4th and final part in our series on doomsday cults at the end of the 20th century. I hope you liked it. Please check out the show notes for links to my guest, retired journalist and author Dick Rivas. His book on Waco is called The Ashes of Waco, an Investigation. Mr. Rivas, who was a civil rights worker with Dr. King's organization in Alabama in 1965 and 66, tells me that he spends his days now writing long Facebook posts. Thanks to everyone who's been sending me suggestions on show ideas. If you have an idea, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me through Twitter at 1990s History. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. You can also email me directly at 90s@curiouscast.ca. That's 90s@curiouscast.ca. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, please feel free to rate and review us. It helps spread the word and get more people to find the show. We're available for free at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and everywhere else you get your streaming audio. You can also listen at curiouscast.ca. This show is hosted and co-written by me, Kathy Kinzora, and Dila Velasquez, our producer. Sound design and final production is by Rob Johnston. See you next time for more history of the 90s. On October 3rd, 1990, fireworks exploded outside the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Germany. Over 1 million people danced and celebrated the rebirth of a country as the German flag was raised and the country's new anthem played triumphantly. East and West Germany were officially reunited after 45 years of Cold War separation. It was the dramatic climax of a dizzying year of change that began when border crossings along the Berlin Wall were flung open, finally allowing friends and family who'd been divided by the concrete barrier to reunite. The nightmare of their forced separation was finally over. I'm Kathy Kinzora, and this is History of the 90s. On this episode, we're looking back at the year that led to the reunification of Germany and the first signs of thawing in the Cold War. Before we dive in, let's start off with a quick history lesson. After the Second World War, Germany was divided. The Allied powers occupied the West and the Soviets the East.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Berlin, which was located in the Soviet zone, was also divided. Over the next 20 years, as East Germany became more and more oppressive, a mass exodus of citizens left the country. Between 1949 and 1961, about 2.6 million East Germans headed west to start a new life. Many of them were skilled workers, intellectuals, and professionals. The Soviets responded by shutting down the border. On August 13, 1961, as Berliners slept, an army of construction workers erected concrete posts and barbed wire. Those who woke up in a fortified East Berlin would remain there for the next 28 years. What began as barbed wire fence policed by armed guards was soon fortified with concrete and guard towers. It completely encircled West Berlin, separating Berliners on both sides from their families, their jobs, and the lives they had known before. When completed, the wall was 155 kilometers long and 4 meters tall. It cut the city of Berlin in half, in some cases going right through homes. A second wall was built on the east side, and the space between the two walls became known as the Death Strip. That's because East German border guards had strict orders to shoot to kill anyone who tried to escape to the west. And that's what they did. About 140 people were gunned down while trying to escape, including 17-year-old Hans Wolf. He climbed a 2.5-meter-high barbed wire fence and then jumped into the icy cold waters of the Resurrected Canal on November 26, 1964. He probably hoped that border guards wouldn't be paying attention. I mean, who was crazy enough to attempt an escape through the freezing water? But the border guards stationed nearby spotted him, and without warning, they began shooting. He called out to the guards, begging them to stop, saying he would surrender, but they carried on, firing a total of 61 shots. One hit Wolf in the chest and killed him. His parents didn't learn of their son's death until 2 days after his failed escape attempt. The official message they were given was he had accidentally drowned while violating the state border. Thousands of other people did make it across, in all kinds of crazy ways. Some crawled through tunnels. One person even made it in a hot air balloon. And others escaped through apartment buildings that in a few places actually made up part of the wall. You see, at first people could simply enter one of these buildings, walk out a back door or window, and they were in West Berlin. But as the government caught on, all exits on the lower floors were bricked up. And that's when people began jumping from second and third story windows, usually into blankets being held by West Berliners below. Eventually, these escape routes were also bricked over. By the 1980s, the Berlin Wall had become a vivid and enduring symbol of Soviet oppression, and a symbol of the tense relationship between East and West that extended well beyond Germany's borders during the Cold War. But things began to change under Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who introduced perestroika and set about reforming the Soviet economy and communist regime. Under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union began to loosen its grip on Eastern Bloc nations. And Gorbachev also began reaching out to the West. It was following a meeting about a possible arms reduction treaty in 1987 between Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan that the U.S. president made his infamous speech near the Berlin Wall in front of the famous Brandenburg Gates.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
This moment and this speech have often been cited as the beginning of the end of the Cold War and the driving force behind the destruction of the Berlin Wall. But that's probably a bit of revisionist history. At the time it was given, Reagan's speech actually didn't get a lot of media coverage. And Western foreign affairs experts viewed it as misguided idealism on Reagan's part, while the Soviet news agency TASS called it openly provocative and warmongering. Gorbachev himself has also said he wasn't impressed with the former actor's rousing call to action. It's really only in hindsight, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that people began viewing Reagan's speech as a harbinger of the changes that would soon sweep across Eastern Europe. So if it wasn't Reagan, what caused this seismic shift? In the end, it came from the ground up. Protest movements led by the people of East Germany pressured the government to finally open the barriers to the West and ultimately bring down the wall. It began in the summer and fall of 1989. Thousands of people were taking part in pro-democracy protests throughout Germany as a fast-moving revolutionary wave was sweeping across Eastern Bloc nations. In East Germany, the epicenter was Leipzig.